In order to make this work, we have to do a lovely thing called rotoscoping. Best of luck and Godspeed to you in that endeavor. All right, people, let's get into it. I'm Garrett, this is Making Movies, and today we're going to get weird. The cinemagraphs are kind of this cool but weird gray area. It's not quite a looping video, and it's not quite a still image. It's somewhere in between. And there are certain apps that will manipulate photos to make them look like they're moving, like clouds are moving or water or whatever, and that's kind of cool. And then, of course, there are looping videos that look like one continuous motion, and that's also super cool. But I kind of thought that there'd be this fun middle ground to play with. What I like the most about certain cinemagraphs is when there's two things that should be moving, but one of them isn't. Playing with that idea of freezing time for some things, but not other things. What if instead of having one thing always be frozen and one thing always be moving, what if we kind of played with that? What if one thing started to move while one was frozen and then they switched? This is a quick and dirty tutorial on how I shoot what I'm calling Cines, because they're not quite cinemagraphs and they're not quite looping videos. They're somewhere in the middle. I'm sure it's not the most streamlined way that you could create this, but as I'm exploring this medium, I'm learning more and more, and I'm going to share what I've learned with you. So here we go. The first thing is how to actually go about shooting this. What I'm interested in doing is creating this hyper micro content for social media. So with that in mind, I have to shoot vertically. Now I know that in the world of filmmaking and cinematography, people are really shying away from the idea that vertical can get integrated into real compelling visuals and storytelling, but I don't think anybody should shy away from it. I think that it is a new, cool, and interesting challenge to rethink the way that we've traditionally done things. And let me tell you, shooting cinematic vertical images is really difficult. I kept finding myself looking at the frame that I was getting and saying, you know, what would make this better is if I just turned the camera and shot this horizontally. If you have a photography background, this is probably something that would come more naturally to you. The key thing to keep in mind when shooting vertically is still maintaining a depth of frame, or having a foreground, midground, and background. It's super easy when we turn the camera to then just try to find a thing to shoot and then not think about the composition. So that's step one. That will make or break anything that you create, because if what you're making isn't visually interesting, the rest of it doesn't matter. You also always want to be shooting in slow motion, as slow of motion as your camera will let you, whether that's 60 or 120 or 240, giving yourself that latitude in post to be able to speed things up and slow things down. The slower motion you can film, the more smooth that final image will be. If you want to learn more about slow motion, how to shoot it, and then how to edit it, there's a link up there for you. We won't get into all of that, but shoot in slow motion. The next thing to think about is in those layers, my foreground, midground, and background. If I don't have full control of a set, if it's not like an enclosed set that I can set things and change things up, we then have to think about our layers in terms of time. So if you are shooting a busy street and you want to play with the stoplight at the top and then the traffic going across, we would actually just set the camera up and film for an extended period of time so I could get the lights to do what I want them to do, and then I can get the traffic to do what I want it to do, and then I can go ahead and manipulate those individual aspects and bring them together in post. Confused yet? It's gonna get weirder. Hang tight, follow with me. The last thing to think about, if we want this thing to loop forever, indefinitely, right, with starting and stopping, every piece of action that you have has to have an in and an out point, something that makes it loopable. So going back to the traffic light scenario, the lights that would be changing yellow, green, red, those are loopable on their own because things turn off and on. But for the traffic, I wanna make sure that that car has an in point and an out point, that it enters the frame and it leaves the frame. So we have shooting vertically, think about that, have layers and depth to your frame, shoot in slow motion, as slow of motion as you can, and then think about your layers in terms of time. Be watching each of those layers as you film to make sure that something interesting happens on every plane. Once you have those things kind of locked in your brain and you're happy with what you've got, we then get it into post. For this process, I use 3 applications. I use Photoshop, Photoshop, I use Premiere, and I use After Effects. If you're somebody who's super familiar in After Effects, you may not need Premiere, but because this is my tutorial and this is a super quick and dirty way to go about doing this thing, I will be using Premiere. So here we go. This is what we're going to be talking about today. So I have a skateboarder in the background who starts and stops, then the foreground skateboarder freezes, enters the frame, freezes again, and this system just loops. The first thing we do is we want to slow down our clip to the appropriate speed here. So I will modify, interpret footage, take this back down to 23.976. The first thing you notice when we bring this in is that the frame is sideways because of course we're shooting with the intent of making it vertical. So we need to create a sequence, and for this, I shot this in 120 frames per second at 1080. So we need to make sure our sequence reflects that. We'll go sequence, new sequence. We'll go to settings, create a custom sequence here at 24 frames per second. And this is where it's going to get weird because we're just going to change these. It's going to be 1080 by 1920 as opposed to, of course, 1920 by 1080 because we're going vertical. And we can see that worked because we see vertical and it is 9 by 16 as opposed to 16 by 9. I click OK, and I have created a sequence here that we can see in my program window. Looks correct. Next step is, of course, I grab this footage and I drag it into my sequence. It's going to ask me if I want to keep my sequence settings or change them. Keep them because we customize them for what we're doing here. Keep sequence settings, and now we see that it's still horizontal. So we double click our footage. It opens up in our source menu. We go to effect controls, and then we want to rotate by -90 degrees. Now we can see it's playing nicely. I can scrub through here and everything looks the way that it should look. Remember when we were talking about thinking about time in terms of layers? That is super important because I want to create a background of things that should be moving but never will, enhancing the effect of the cine. How we do that is we scrub through our footage until we find people in interesting places. What I want to do is I want to create a series of frames that I can then go through and composite a final background image of a bunch of different moving things that weren't necessarily all there at the same time. So I click export frame. It will give me this option. I generally like to export it as a TIFF file that retains all of the visual information that I will need. I'm not losing any image quality by exporting and re-importing because I want to keep this as clear as possible. So I'll export it as a TIFF, save it to the desktop, click OK. And I'll just do these for different parts in time that I find really interesting that I want to then use for my final background frame. Now I open all of these images in Photoshop, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste the layers onto one of these frames. So this is a frame that I really like. I've got this guy who's standing here and that guy who's behind him. I know that I'm going to use those. So we'll use this frame as the one that we paste everything to. I'm going to grab this frame, select all, cut, close that out and paste it there. And then same with this frame here. Grab all of this, paste it on top of here. I have 3 layers in my Photoshop file, all that have different things. We're going to be basing it off of this layer here. For this layer, I want this guy here and I want this guy here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna use the marquee tool and I'm going to make a wide selection of this guy and a wide selection of this guy. I'm then going to copy, Command C, copy, and then I'm going to paste just as it is. And what you'll see here, it's created a new layer that if I hide these two, it's just these parts of this frame. So I can go ahead and I can delete layer 1 because I don't need that anymore because layer 1 was just for those people. So we go to layer 2 up here, and layer 2, I really only want this guy. So again, we'll make a wide selection of this guy, copy, paste right into place, and remove that background. So now I have my 3 additional people on top of my background. And you can see here that it's not perfect. The sun was going down as I was shooting this. Here's a really easy way just to make this all flow together. I'm going to use my erase tool, which is over here. If I 2-finger click on my image, I have this option for hardness. I set hardness to 0. This allows me to go through and paint around him in a way that is going to have a really nice roll off, so there won't be any hard edges for it to match to. So I'm pretty happy with that there. And again, if I bring the background back, all of a sudden now I just have a guy appear out of nowhere. We're gonna do the same thing for these two guys here. So now you can see I've added my different people in different points in time, and we went from an image that looked like this to an image that looks like this. It makes the skate park look like it was more full than it was at any one time, and it makes for a very interesting background. People that should be moving, people that don't necessarily have to be moving, but it looks lively. I will then save this as a Photoshop document again, so I don't lose any of my image quality by exporting and importing and exporting and importing. So I've used Premiere to give me the frames that I then took into Photoshop, turned into layers, made one background. Now we're gonna take all of that into After Effects. You can see here I have my background image and I have the footage that I'm going to be using. So we will go to our composition settings, and then we are going to make sure that our aspect ratio is 9:16, not 16:9, because we are shooting vertically. So here we have the width is 1080 and the height is 1920, which is what we want. We're going to change our duration here to 5 minutes. Just of course, we're playing with time and we want to give ourselves enough room to edit. So we will click OK. Again, we shot in slow motion, so we need to interpret this footage down as well. We will right click, go to interpret footage, main. Here it will show our frame rate. We want to conform that frame rate to 23.976. Hit OK. Drag that footage down into our composition, hit R, which is the hotkey for rotation, -90 for 90 degrees, and we can see that it now works perfectly. Now what you do is you scrub the footage for the action that you want. And there's two skateboarders in particular that we're going to be using for this example. Super easy. So if we hit Command-Shift-D, I can actually split this layer up. So then we have the entrance, perfect, and exit. So there's a really nice clean break here. We'll do the same thing for our background skateboarder. We see him enter frame, he does his trick, and then we see him stop there. Now you're probably thinking, but Garrett, he doesn't leave the frame. Like, how do we make him leave the frame? Now remember, if we go back to our background image here, we actually put a guy here, and if we watch the motion of what this character does, he leaves and then stands directly behind where I put that other person. Now, I had the wherewithal to do that ahead of time because of course I've already done this, but you need to find creative ways of making exit points for your characters. Now that I have my two moments of action here, in order to make this work, we have to do a lovely thing called rotoscoping. If you're unfamiliar with rotoscoping, basically what it is you're making a mask around a character that is going through and moving, and what that will do is that will separate that person from everything that's happening around them. It's not difficult to do, it is tedious work. We're not going to spend the time doing that here. We're going to fast forward into the future where I've already done it. Welcome to the future, here we are, and you can see I have my background skateboarder that I have rotoscoped, where I'm just making kind of a rough mask around them as they're doing their trick. And then I do the same for my foreground character. We see them enter, looking really good. I got some of the shadow down there. You can see here it's super dirty. It's not that clean. I didn't spend that much time doing it, but that's the idea. You can tighten the mask, make the mask a little smoother, a little better, depending on what you're doing, but that's the general effect. That's rotoscoping. Best of luck and Godspeed to you in that endeavor. Once I have those two things put together, I can then bring in my Cinemagraph background PSD that we created together. And what you'll see here is then it works where I have my skateboarder in the background, and then I have my skateboarder come through in the foreground and do their trick, all in super, super smooth 120 frames per second. This is where we can kind of split and spend our time either in Premiere or in After Effects. Again, if you're comfortable in After Effects, you can stay here and finish this part here. I'm not that comfortable doing time remapping in After Effects, so I'm gonna move over to Premiere to do time remapping where it makes a little more sense to me. I understand I can start a flame war with the After Effects people against the Premiere people, but it doesn't matter. Use what's most comfortable for you. It's really about the process that's important, not necessarily which application you're using. The next thing we want to do is we want to import everything we did in After Effects into Premiere. This again prevents us from having to export and import and lose image quality as we do that. So if we just open up our import tab, come here, go to After Effects, this is what we were working with, and click import, it will ask us which comps we want to import. This was the name of my clip and I was too lazy to rename it, so I'm going to just open that composition up. You'll see that it's here, it's playing back at 23,976, and if I click and I drag that down into here, I have my skateboarders nice and lined up. With dynamic linking, or what was formerly known as dynamic linking, it live updates everything that you do in After Effects to Premiere. So if I make a change to this in After Effects, that will then automatically change it in Premiere for me. For what I want to do, I have my background layer hidden, so it's just my two skateboarders here, which is perfect. I will then cut this, remove that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate my two skateboarders here. So if we see this guy comes up and jumps and then is gone, there's a moment here before this guy enters, I'm going to split this. I'm then going to move both of these up, and I'm going to move my foreground character up one extra level, and I will then come in here and I will grab my background, throw that in there. Don't worry about the rest of this. We'll get to all that in a minute. You'll see I have my background skateboarder and I have my foreground skateboarder. What I want to do is I want to find the key point where I want them to freeze in time. So like right about there is a pretty good place for this guy to freeze. And I'm actually going to cut that layer there. And then the same thing with this here. Right as he starts to fall, we'll cut that there. Now it gets weird because we're actually going to reverse the order. We're gonna have the first part happen before the second part, and the second half happen before the first part. Next step is we need to get a freeze frame of each of these people in their peak motions. We'll go to the last frame of the shot. We'll go back to our export frame, export it as a TIFF, but then of course I want to import it into my project as well. So I will click OK. You see this image show up right there. I will then drag that to the end of this, cut that in half, and the beginning of this clip here. And what you'll see happen is that our character will go up to their moment that we like and then stop, which is perfect. Just like we'll see them at the beginning here be frozen and then start their motion again. The next piece is playing with speed. We want to actually time remap, so then that way they go from looking like they're moving normally to this slow stop into frozen time. And the way that we do that is we two-finger click on this effects badge icon here, click time remapping and click speed. You'll see that this line then moves to the middle of my clip. That lets me know that we are playing at 100%, so I can move it up or down as needed. We then use the pen tool over here, and I can then select my keyframe. So the keyframe that I actually want to freeze on is this last keyframe in the shot. So I'll come all the way to the end here, select this, go back to my move tool, and then I can click and I can drag these keyframes apart. I want this to begin at the start of the ramp. Everything that I have happen here, I want this to happen in regular speed. And then I want this to be a slow into my stop. I shot in 120 frames, and 120 frames is 5 times faster approximately than 24 frames. I actually will just increase this speed up to 500%. So we'll go all the way up until it gives me 500, lovely, 500%. So then you can see if I grab this and I move this in here, you'll see that it starts out, he looks normal, and then slows to a stop. That's the effect that we're gonna be doing on all of this. You use this speed ramping, and then there's a Bezier here that if I really wanted to zoom in, I could adjust this Bezier and make that slow happen a little more smoothly like that. I'm gonna go ahead and do that for all of these clips for the ins and outs, and then we'll kind of get to the next point. So now I've played with that time a little bit, and you can see here that I start with my frozen character here, which is the freeze frame, while the other character is moving. They stop, then the next one begins, and we kind of hit this little cycle here where it will loop, because I never want them both to be moving at the same time. Now we get to color this. Because this is not quite video and it's not quite photo and it's somewhere in between, we can kind of just go wild with the color. The first thing I want to do though is, because I shot this in log, I want to color this to make this look normal. To do that, we'll make an adjustment layer here. So we go to new adjustment layer. I want it to match the sequence settings that I have, and we will drag this over the top of everything. We can then go into the Lumetri color panel, and I have a Rec 709 LUT for my footage. And you can see right off the bat that before and after makes a big difference. But I want to stylize this. I want to make this thing look really, really cool. So with that, all I'll do is I'll get gradients of different colors and abstracts and things to put over the top. You can create those on your own. I just do some Google image searching. I came up with a couple of things here that I found. I liked this one. It kind of has some cool bokeh style lens flare looks to it. I also liked this one because of how uneven it was. And so I can just click and drag both of these down into my sequence here, and I can go to effect controls and again change the rotation to 90 so I can fill my frames, and I can bring those up over the top of my footage. We will play with the blending mode. So if I select a layer here, you can see that under opacity, it has blending mode. If I click multiply, or I click lighten, or I click overlay, it changes how that image works. And I can then of course adjust the amount of it that I want. This is all just play on your own. So do whatever you want to make that look how you would like it to. This is what it looks like if it was to be normal. And then once I start to add these layers into it, now my color starts to look really, really cool and really, really stylized. I know this is not the most straightforward tutorial. Again, this is a process that I'm learning. This is something that I'm exploring, and I want to explore it with you. If you discover workflows or things that streamline this process or make this easier, share them with me. Let me know what you're doing. I'm so curious to see what people come up with and how creative people can get with a format like this. If you found this helpful, give this video a like. If you want to see more stuff like this, hit subscribe, and as always, I will see you in the next episode.